Something I just wanted to point out, maybe some of you guys saw it, is that I posted a correction. So there's an updated version of the slides, and I'll show you what that is in just a second. But I wanted to make sure that you guys understood the planning for motor movement happens in the motor association area, and the sending out of the plan happens in the primary motor cortex. Okay, so I think I had this switched on the slides, and I'll show you that to you in just a second. But what I did is I posted an updated version of the slides that has it all corrected. Okay, all right, so it's all corrected on that version. And for those that haven't taken a look at some of the other additional lecture resources, there's a brain lecture worksheet, so you guys can go in here and label structures, figuring out where they're located. And there's also a brain table, all right, to help you guys study. So being able to go in and write what some of the major functions are of some of these structures that we're talking about, right? So there's some study resources here in Blackboard that maybe some folks may not have been aware of. Okay, so like I said, what ended up happening is basically this and this got switched around, so I put them in the right order now. Okay, and so I want to start off with this, talking about primary and association areas. And remember the sensory, primary area for sensory information. If you think about route of information, first it has to have some sort of destination, and then you are going to use information to try to identify and interpret what that sensory information is. And remember the words identifying and interpreting with respect to sensory information, that's always happening here with association areas. Now, if you want to respond to some sensory information, the kind of choreography or the planning for the movement happens in the association area of the motor. So motor association area. Okay? Now the plan gets then relayed to the primary motor area to be sent out. So in order to be able to, say, walk upstairs, you have to know where you're at, where your legs are at, where your right leg's at, left leg's at, how much to raise your leg, how much pressure to put on to raise your body, and all this information, right? So some of that takes a lot of planning, takes organization. And so that starts here, the intention to be able to move starts here, the choreography for that starts here in the association area, the motor association area, right? So your intention starts there, and then you start assembling a plan, and then it gets kind of relayed to this primary area. It's kind of like the errand person, so if they're sending out orders, okay, this is a person that's sending out the orders, this is a person making the orders, right, putting them together. All right, is that clear to folks? All right. So, like we said, there's a lot of primary sensory areas. These are areas where we're getting input. Well, the input is kind of destined to be, as their destination, and then it's going to be sent out among other structures for interpreting and integrating that information. So that's going to happen in association areas. If you take a look at where the primary and association areas, a lot of times they're anatomically, closely located to each other. So if we take a look at, say, the primary or the association, motor association area, it's next to the primary motor area. Same thing with the sensory association and the primary, sensory cortex, right? So here's the association area for the sensory, here's the primary sensory cortex, located next to each other. So this theme happens fairly regularly, but not always, right? So generally they're anatomically closely associated with each other, which kind of makes sense if you want to send information off. Generally it's not going to be something that you want to have that's far away. All right, so first we're going to kind of talk about the sensory information and how it gets routed. So the plan of how to approach this is we're kind of going from the information flow. So you have some sort of sensory information, how is that going to be interpreted and integrated? And then if you're going to respond with the motor response, then we're going to follow that. Okay, so here, the order in which I'm presenting this is going to be the kind of the order in which the information flows. Everybody following me on that? So here, one of the first places that sensory information is getting routed, and here we're talking about a lot of the, feel, a lot of the cutaneous sensations. They're going to be routed for perception into the cortex, and specifically they're going into this primary sensory cortex or somatosensory cortex. Now, this primary somatosensory cortex is located in the postcentral gyrus. So if we take a look at our brain here, so here's our central sulcus. In front of that is our precentral gyrus, part of the frontal lobe. This postcentral gyrus is the gyrus that's located just posterior. So just posterior to that central sulcus. So it's this first gyrus here. It's part of the parietal lobe. Okay? So that's what we're talking about. Now, the actual mapping of this, so that the different regions of this primary somatosensory cortex, okay, can be mapped to different regions of our body. And you can see that some of these regions are larger, some of them are smaller, right? So here, the size of that area, that region there, so for instance the hands, is reflective of how much sensory information we're getting from that region. So hands we're getting quite a bit compared to, say, the intra-abdominal, okay, or say, here, the knee, okay. There's a lot more sensory information coming from our hands, texture, right? So this kind of showing of the size of the different parts of our body based upon kind of the neuronal information coming to it is something called a homunculus. And so here, this is basically taking a look at, well, where is a lot of sensory information coming from? Well, not surprisingly, hands, face, mouth, and so forth, right? Okay, so here the size of these, parts of our body are indicating how much sensory information is being relayed. Okay? Right? And so remember here, this is where the sensory information comes in. Right? The association area, so here, that's where we're going to identify and interpret that sensory information. Okay? So here, this is going to be, we have several types of association areas. Right? So here we're going to talk about the somatosensory association area, but we also have the somatic motor association area, so that's the output, right? But we also have other association areas, right? So if we kind of take a look at these and group them, so we can see that the visual, auditory, and somatosensory, which is the one we just looked at, are all sensory information. Okay? All sensory information. This one is motor. Okay? So this is where that plan to, your intent to actually physically move, so intent is started, so it's kind of like the choreographer of movement, starts creating that plan. For language, so we have one area that's involved with, say, understanding words, being able to go from, say, seeing certain objects to identifying what the words are associated with that object, right? So here, that's happening. That's going to be integration and identification. And then we have that prefrontal cortex, which is largely the executive, which is going to be involved with a lot of reasoning, judgment, intellect, and so forth, right? A lot of executive functions. So these are just all the association areas, and then I put also the additional grouping as to whether they're sensory, motor, or in this case, executive, higher order kind of association area. Okay? All right. So here, the parietal lobe, remember, here's our primary somatosensory cortex. This is where the sensory information is coming in that I showed you a few slides ago. That gets routed to here, our sensory association area. Okay, so the sensory association area, it's involved with identifying and interpreting. Remember, association you should hear when we talk about senses, identifying and interpreting. So if you guys have anything in your pocket or in your book bag or in your purse, if you reach into it, all right, without looking, you're using this part of your brain to figure out, oh, is that a coin? And maybe what type of coin is it? Is it a penny? Is it a quarter? Is it a dime? Right? Is that chapstick? So you're basically using this part of the brain to identify what you're feeling. So that sensory information is coming all the way up to your brain, then being routed to this association area for doing this identification. Right? It also is involved with being able to look at something and predict how it might feel. So if you see sandpaper, you would kind of predict that it's probably rough, not smooth, right? So this part of your brain's involved with that as well. Okay? Does that make sense to folks? All right. Okay, so integrates and interprets the somatic sensory input, right? And so, when you guys do this, you're using this part of your brain. That sensory information is going to the primary, then it's being routed to the association, sensory association area, both of which are located in the parietal lobe. Okay, so now we're going to switch on over to looking at this somatic motor part. So here, we're going to start off with so say you are going to buy a soda, and let's say it's, decades ago, so a soda only cost a quarter, all right, in the vending machine. All right? So here, what are you going to do? You reach in your pocket, you have a bunch of change in there, okay? And you find what feels like a quarter. So now, you have to initiate a plan. You have to design some sort of choreography in order to take that coin out and put it in the slot for the vending machine. Okay? So here, that all is going to start here in this motor association area. So our motor association area is in the frontal lobe. It's up here. Okay? So that plan to do that, and your intention, starts there. Where does it get routed to next? Well, it's going to be routed to the primary motor cortex. Okay? So here, we're starting the choreography, the planning of skilled motor movement, to be able to take that quarter out of your pocket among all the other coins, and then put it into the vending machine coin slot, right? And so here, it is not the only thing involved, but starts the process of coordinating the movement of several muscles, right? In order to pull that coin out, you have to have finger muscles, you have to have your arm muscles, and so forth, right? And so some motor memories can be stored here, so there's also some repetitiveness that can be stored, but that also is going to be involved with the cerebellum and the brainstem too. Okay. All right. But this whole choreography, this planning, this intention, starts here in this motor association area. It gets sent to this primary motor cortex. So here, if we look at it, all right, so just as a review, so our primary somatosensory cortex was here. The sensory association area was here, which is in the parietal lobe. Here we're talking about the frontal lobe, which has our primary motor and motor association area. So our ability to start planning, so our intent starts here in the motor association area, and then gets passed on to the primary motor cortex. The primary motor cortex is going to be the precentral gyrus. So the central sulcus separates what happens with the motor from what happens with the sensory, right? So sensory is going to be in the parietal lobe, the motor is going to be in the frontal lobe. All right? Okay? So here we started our intent with the motor association area, and that information got passed on to the primary motor cortex, which is located in the precentral gyrus. Okay? So here, if this is our central sulcus, this whole area is our, hold on, yeah, there we go. This whole area is our frontal lobe. That's going to be our parietal lobe. Here's our precentral gyrus, postcentral gyrus. Okay, so that is going to take that plan that was started to be assembled there in the motor association area and send it out, right? In order to take that coin out of the, among the other coins that you have in your pocket. So here, the plan is being sent out for this precise skeletal muscle movement. Now, speech, language, also has kind of an association and a primary area. So here, the ability to actually physically speak happens here in this, what's called the Broca's area. It's in the frontal lobe, okay? The frontal lobe. There's another area that's kind of associated with speech, which we talked about. It's involved with interpretation. So here, it's one of those situations where the names of different regions don't have the word primary and association in them, but they kind of fall in those two categories. All right? So here, if someone has a lesion or a problem in the Broca's area, okay, what are they going to have a problem with? Actually speaking. How about if you write something down, are they going to be able to understand that? Yes. How about if you tell them? Yes. Are they going to be able to write their response down? Yes. Yeah. The problem with understanding and responding to language outside of physical speech is not affected here. For all these areas of the brain that we're going to be talking about, one of the things you should think about is what happens if something goes wrong in that area? What's that going to look like? Right? So here, not being able to speak, this is called aphasia. So Broca's aphasia. All right? Okay. All right, and so here, so what happens if it's damaged? We talked about that. So here, just kind of reviewing. So the primary motor cortex here, all right, is in the precentral gyrus. The primary sensory cortex is in the postcentral gyrus. Here we're talking about motor-related responses. Here we're talking about sensory input, right? Somatosensory input. So just like what we saw with the postcentral gyrus with the sensory information, we also have, the size of those regions of our body where we have finer skilled movement that are having larger populations of neuronal input. So not surprisingly, our hands, right, in order to do skilled movement, have a lot more innervation, right? And so once again, we have a homunculus, right, that indicates, how much skilled movement neuronal input we have in those different areas. Okay, so not surprisingly, so facial expressions and so forth also are fairly large. So the Broca's area that we were talking about, where we had skilled movement for speech, right, is located in this area here. The area that's more association related for speech, being able to identify language, interpret it, understand language, is going to be over in this area. It's called the Wernicke's area. Right? So if someone has a problem in the Wernicke's area, they have a lesion, right? What is that going to look like? What do you guys think? Yeah, what is that? They're having a difficulty understanding in some cases, right? What about articulating the response? What do you guys think? What's that? Say that again. It's not like dyslexia, because, I think the problem here is their speech apparatus, ability to form speech, affected. The Broca's area is not affected. So it turns out what ends up happening with these individuals is that they have problems with associating words in order to articulate them, but they're very fluent. So it kind of, in some cases, the extreme cases, it comes out as gibberish. Okay? Right? So it comes out as gibberish. So they don't have problems speaking, right? But they have problems with being able to put together a response or understand what you're saying, and interpreting language, right? Where is this located? It's in the temporal lobe. So certain types of dementia that affect the temporal lobe, and so they have, problems with understanding language. All right. So here, we also have to, in order to understand speech, we have to figure out, okay, our auditory, so we have our auditory association area is taking those, this sound information that's coming in from our ears and helping us decide, is that speech, is that music, what is it? All right? And so let's see if this plays. I might have to.
Let's use a brief cue consisting of nothing but sine waves. I'll play it 3 times.
It was a sunny day and the children were going to the park. It was a sunny day and the children were going to the park. It was a sunny day and the children were going to the park.
It almost does sound like speech, doesn't it? But it's not quite clear what it's saying. Well, suppose someone told you that it says,
it was a sunny day and the children were going to the park.
Now listen to it again. I'll play it twice.
It was a sunny day and the children were going to the park. It was a sunny day and the children were going to the park.
This time, it's almost impossible not to hear the words that you've been preconditioned to hear. Let's play another one. This one is harder. I'll play the sine waves twice, then the words, then the sine waves twice again.
Please return to the museum. 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 Please return to the museum.
Pretty cool, huh?
So when we, all this was taking various sine waves, putting them together. It's kind of like randomly hitting keys on a keyboard, and then somehow you get some words that come together as a sentence that you think is understandable and maybe makes sense, right? But what your brain is doing with this is it's going through this and saying, oh, that kind of sounds like language. I should route this to the language interpretation center of our brain, right? And then once you have a memory of what this is, so when he told you what it sounded like, it sounded much clearer, didn't it? Reason is you were accessing some of that memory information, right? When you heard it again the second time. All right. So, sure. All right. So Wernicke's, largely in the temporal lobe, a little bit overlaps in the parietal. Understanding language. So anytime we're talking about understanding, interpreting, identifying, you should think that's our association area, right? So if you see the word association, you should also be thinking identifying, interpreting, and so forth, understanding. And so here, being able to access complex visual and auditory memories. In order to be able to understand something, a lot of times you have to have a past experience to reference to, right? So hopefully that makes sense to folks. So we talked about what happens if this is damaged already, okay? So next one, so we've talked about sound, we've talked about some, skilled motor movement, but we also have for primary visual cortex and also the visual association area located in the occipital lobe. And so here, that primary visual information, and maybe a little bit later in the quarter, I'll show you a short, brief documentary clip on something called, sounds like an oxymoron, blind sight. Blind sight, where people can't see anything, but if you move something up or down, they know whether you moved it up or down. Pretty amazing, yeah. And so when we get to talking about vision, we'll talk a little bit more about that, right? So here, the primary visual cortex, that's where the visual sensory information's coming in. In order to interpret it, it's going on in the association area, all right? So once again, this idea that if it's sensory information, the primary is the first destination. Being able to identify and interpret it is happening in the association area, okay? Now, you can be influenced by past experiences, whether they be good or bad, right? So here, influenced by emotions, expectations, past experiences, right? So here, once again, if you see sandpaper, part of that is going to be referencing past experiences, right? Okay, so taking a look at this. You say, well, what does that cloud look like? Rabbit, right? In order to be able to say that, you would have to know what a rabbit looks like, right? So if you've never seen a rabbit before, you probably look at that and like, oh, it's a pretty nice cloud, right? That's about it. Okay. So is there any movement here? So it kind of tricks your eyes a little bit, right? So you kind of see like, well, maybe there is movement, and then it goes back to you saying that there's no movement. At least that's how I saw it when I looked at it, right? And so this is all going on in that primary, the visual association area. Right? So what are we looking at? So once again, you're trying to interpret this. So what do people see? So I heard either two faces or maybe a face, right? So it's difficult to figure out, right? So your visual association area is trying to distinguish. So here, I think, if you're far away, what does this look like? A skull, right? But if you get up close, right, so here, your association area is once again coming into play, trying to interpret what this is looking like. All right, so here, this prefrontal cortex has all those executive functions that we talked about. So we're talking about behavior, personality planning, decision making, intellect comes into here, some working memory. So what we're talking about working memory is kind of what you have going on right now that you need to access, okay? Individuals that have this part of their brain affected, what would that look like? So some are going to be looking a little bit hyperactive. It's a possibility. But remember, this is personality and behavior. So someone's personality and behavior would probably be changed, right? Okay? So there are certain types of dementia. There's a behavioral variant that has this part of the brain, the frontal lobe, affected, and it's very challenging for caregivers because the person, generally a caregiver is a family member who's lived with these individuals for decades, knows their behavior and personality. Then they have some sort of dementia, which changes it. It's almost like living with another person. It's very emotionally challenging, right? If you damage this, so I don't know if you guys have heard about Phineas Gage. So he's a worker in the 1800s who was tamping down an explosive with an iron rod, and the explosive went off and shot the rod through his skull into this part of the brain and went clear through. Okay? And he pulled it out, and beforehand he was a fairly reasonable and easygoing guy. Afterwards, they said that he had fits of the grossest of profanity, and that he couldn't handle situations, and he had inappropriate comments, right? Why? Because he had a lesion in this area. Was there a question in the back? Yeah, go ahead. Bipolar, I'm not sure if it could be, but I don't think this part of the brain's majorly affected. You know, you could have some aspects, because generally with the psychiatric disorders, they're on a spectrum. And so here, you know, you could have some individuals with bipolar that might have some instances where this part of the brain's affected, but it's not the major area. Yeah. It's called frontotemporal dementia, and it's a behavioral variant. Okay? So there's three, if you're interested, there's three variants I've worked at as a postdoc. There's a temporal and parietal one. So there's one called the semantic dementia that affects the ability to understand language. So those individuals, if you show them a picture of, say, a boy flying a kite, and you ask them, what is that boy doing? Oh, he's flying this, you know, or he's doing this. They can't get those words together, right? They have problems with that. The other part is affecting the Broca's area. And so that's called progressive non-fluent aphasia, which means that they progressively lose the ability to speak. All right, so just comparing, looking at the cortex, we have the primary motor, primary somatosensory, primary visual, primary auditory, and then we have that speech area, and then we have the association areas, right? If it's sensory, then you should think identifying, interpreting, understanding, right? Primary is where all that sensory information is first being routed. If it's a motor component, the association area is doing the planning, the choreography. And then that plan gets sent out to the primary motor area. Everybody understand the difference between primary and association? Because we're going to move on from the cerebrum. Okay? Now, Alzheimer's disease is the most common type of dementia for people over 65. Affects a lot of folks. And like I said, one of the major problems is that a lot of the caregivers are family members. And so it's a big strain on the family emotionally, and then also it's a huge burden, psychologically and financially. So there's still researching exactly all the molecular details for what causes the disease. What we do know is that there's decreased acetylcholine, which is a neurotransmitter that's used in the brain. There seems to be neuron death that happens, and that you have buildup of certain proteins that are called plaques. Okay? And so you can see these plaques that are built up in surrounding tissue, and it's a little bit on the debatable side exactly how much plaque you need before you start compromising nervous tissue function, and whether that plaque, is even causing nervous tissue dysfunction. So anyway, but we do know that they accumulate, right? What exactly they're doing for the progression of the disease, not quite known. So if you see here, mild Alzheimer's disease, severe Alzheimer's disease, what do you see in the difference between those two? So hopefully what you're seeing is you see kind of more spaces, right? So you're starting to see more spaces. You're losing some of this neuronal mass. So it's affecting the cerebrum a lot, which means we're losing a lot of this higher order cerebral functions. So we're talking about all those things that we think about learning in memory, language, problems with being able to judge, so, personality, being able to take social cues, say things appropriately, handling money. So here, the costs of healthcare is quite high for people that are in advanced ages. Compounding that problem is the fact that they have difficulty reasoning to make good financial judgment, right? Also, you have problems with motor movement, so gait, walking, and then also here speaking. Okay, right? So, when we talk about things that affect the cerebrum, like Alzheimer's disease, we're talking about affecting a lot of things that are really important for normal function of life, right? Okay? Now, up to this point, we've really talked about the cortex, right? So remember, the cortex is the gray matter of the cerebrum, right? It's kind of this somewhat outer layer. Now we're going to talk about some of these inner layers here, okay, that are underneath or deeper to the cortex. This is where we have the white matter. And maybe this hemisphere of the brain is going to be a little bit better for showing that. So if you can see in here, this is the white matter that's underlying this. So we're going to talk about some of this white matter that's in here. Now, just like the spinal cord, okay, white matter is composed of axons that are myelinated, all right? So they're going to be pathways. So once again, just like the spinal cord, remember the spinal cord and the brain are part of the central nervous system. These are called tracts, right? T-R-A-C-T-S, tracts. It's where we have conduction from the cell body to a axon terminus along an axon, okay? Right? They're tracts. And so here, what are they doing? Well, they're helping connect different parts of the brain. They can be connecting different parts within the same hemisphere. They can be, one of the important structures here is connecting one hemisphere to the other hemisphere of the cerebrum. It's a very prominent structure. It's called the corpus callosum. So this is going to be able to, for our two hemispheres to coordinate together to carry out function. Now, if you remember when we talked about motor movement, so here, remember, we have the primary motor cortex on our left hemisphere and on our right hemisphere. So if we are reaching into our pockets to pull out that quarter with our right hand, it was the left hemisphere that initiated that process. Okay? It's the left hemisphere that initiated that process. In order to be able to do that, you have to have some connections between the right and the left hemisphere. Not necessarily here in the brain, but you have to have this crossing over event. And so I put an article up for why the brain does this crossing over that's called decussation. So if you guys are interested in that, let me know. Sorry, go ahead, Ashley. Yes, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, it's a great question. Do we have ascending and descending? Yeah, absolutely. We have to have, information going all the way up to that, primary somatosensory cortex. And then we have to have information coming out from the primary motor cortex. So we do have information coming in and going out. So here, not only does this white matter connect different parts of the brain, but it connects the brain to the brain stem, the cerebellum, and the spinal cord. Right? Okay. Absolutely. All right, so it's there to connect different parts of the brain, and then also to lower brain centers like the brainstem and the cerebellum and specifically the spinal cord, right? Because remember, in the spinal cord, we have sensory information coming in, and then we have motor information coming out, right? So if you remember when we talked about neurons that came out of the spinal cord, or sensory information, sensory neurons, the cluster of cell bodies we call the ganglia, right? We called those clusters of cell bodies ganglia. So in the peripheral nervous system, the cluster of cell bodies are called ganglia. Here in the central nervous system, the cluster of cell bodies where we could have gray matter are called nuclei. And just like you guys remember, if it's gray matter, then it's basically not myelinated axons. It could be dendrites and cell bodies, which is here is where we could get one neuron synapsing with another neuron, right? Is happening here in the ganglia. So it's kind of a relay station. Happens in these ganglia, right? And that's really deep in the brain. And so you can see some of the ganglia in here, right, as we sectioned into this brain. So the deeper structures of the brain, so as we go interior, okay, so we get closer to the interior of the brain, we have these kind of relay stations, these ganglia, okay, or nuclei, excuse me. They are the equivalent to the ganglia that we see in the peripheral nervous system. All right? And so what is happening here? Well, we're getting kind of integration of information, right? We're getting information from different parts of our brain, and so it influences the movement. So it fine tweaks that choreography or that planned motor movement, right, as it's being sent out to actually pull that quarter out of your pocket. Yeah. Right. Also, what's happening here is that we have some subconscious things going on. So in order to be able to hold on to that quarter, right, you're not constantly thinking, hold on to the quarter, hold on to the quarter, hold on to the quarter, right? So, here there's some subconscious things, some conscious things going on. And some of it helps with rigidity and stiffness. And that there are going to be certain structures in here that dopamine is involved with. So there's a part in the midbrain where neurons inhibit this area, so they help smooth movement out. So that your movement is smooth, so you can put that coin, that quarter, into the coin slot of the vending machine. For those that don't have enough dopamine, so individuals with Parkinson's disease, for instance, they have trouble with being able to coordinate this fine motor movement. They don't have the smooth movement, the fine motor detail to do this. Okay? All right? And this is going to take us into the deeper structures here. So here, before I get into this, I'm just going to show you guys what this area is, and then we'll take a break. So here we're getting into the diencephalon. And we're going to be looking at two structures, the thalamus and the hypothalamus, and then related, but not part of the diencephalon or the pituitary and the pineal gland. And the diencephalon is this structure in here. Okay? So I took it out of this hemisphere. So it fit in here like this. If we take this out, right? So this is part of the diencephalon. So if you remember, I showed you guys that video of how the brain develops in neonates. It folds back on itself. Well, one of the structures it's folding back on becomes the diencephalon. All right? Okay? So we're going to talk about what's happening in the diencephalon here. All right? So why don't we take a 5-minute break, and then after